This is Module 3, Part 3 in our unit on Buddhism. And in this video we're going to cover briefly the three sects, the three major sects of Buddhism, the Triple Gem, the 10 precepts, and important principles. There are three primary sects in the religion of Buddhism, and we've come across these a bit earlier in our discussion of the scriptures. First, the oldest sect is the Theravada sect. And Theravada, the term basically means wisdom of the elders. It appears to be the oldest sect of Buddhism, and one of the indications of that is geographically where it's found. We find the Theravada sect practiced in Sri Lanka, and then in extreme Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. Some feel it's the most authentic sect of Buddhism in that it has remained closest to the teachings of the Buddha. Also, too, as I said, is the oldest sect of Buddhism. Another important point here is that to Theravada Buddhist, the Buddha was a man, a human being that was born, lived, and died, and eventually attained enlightenment. In other words, they do not worship the Buddha as a god or a divine figure. They see him as a superhuman being, perhaps, very special. Obviously, he attained enlightenment during his lifetime, something that rarely happens. And they see him as a paragon of spiritual virtue, and they follow his teachings and try to walk the path of the Buddha, develop a Buddha nature, so to speak. But that's it. They don't worship the Buddha, they don't pray to the Buddha, they instead venerate, respect, and follow the Buddha. And of course they have their own scriptures, the Pali canon, P-A-L-I for the language in which the scriptures were written. Then we have the Mahayana sect. As was noted earlier, the collection of scriptures associated with the Mahayana sect is the Chinese canon, written in Chinese. The word Mahayana means greater vehicle. Yana is vehicle, Maha means great, so greater vehicle. And the idea is that those who associate or affiliate with the Mahayana sect of Buddhism feel that their form of Buddhism is a bit more practical for larger groups of people. And in fact, it did develop later, after the Theravada sect had developed, and at least in my opinion, it seems as though as Buddhism spread northwards to China, the Koreas, Japan, which is the primary areas where we find Mahayana Buddhism, also Vietnam as well, it seems as though Buddhism picked up a sort of theistic tone. So in fact, Mahayana Buddhists do see the Buddha, and in fact many other Buddhas that have come before the current Buddha for our historical age, Siddhartha, they see all of these Buddhas as gods, and they do pray to them and worship them as gods. So the Mahayana sect of Buddhism is definitely theistic. And then finally, the third sect of Buddhism is the Vajrayana. Again, you hear that word yana, which means vehicle. Vajra means diamond, so the diamond vehicle. And this is primarily Tibetan Buddhism, although we also find it practiced in Mongolia and Bhutan as well. Vajrayana Buddhism is a bit different because of the influences of Tibetan culture, Tibetan religions, and Tibet has definitely left its mark on this type of Buddhism because there are things that are associated with Tibetan Buddhism that you don't find in other forms of Buddhism. So for example, the idea of the Lama, a sort of lifetime position, spiritual position that passes on to someone else through reincarnation. For example, the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, that institution began in the 13th century, and we currently have the 14th Dalai Lama, and he's considered to be the spiritual and political head of Tibet. The current Dalai Lama lives in Dharamsala, India, because he's in exile, because around 1950 or so the Chinese brutally and without provocation invaded and annexed Tibet, and they're still there today. And many people say what's been happening since that time is basically a cultural and ethnic genocide. There's a documentary I'd like you to watch on the topic, and I think you'll find it somewhat disturbing. So in Tibet, you have the tradition of the lamas. Also, too, they have prayer wheels there, which can be huge wheel-like structures, huge cylindrical structures with scriptures written on them that you turn, or they can be flags on which scriptures are written, and as they flap in the breeze or as the wheels are turned, it's as if these scriptures are being said for all mankind. And of course, Vajrayana Buddhism also has its own collection of scriptures, some 650 volumes that was discussed earlier. I'll begin my discussion with the Triple Gem with a very famous prayer of Buddhism. It goes something like this in Pali: Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami, Dutiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami, Tatiyampi Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. Basically, this means I take my refuge in the Buddha, I take my refuge in the Dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, the teachings of the Buddha, and finally, I take my refuge in the Sangha, the community of Buddhist monks and nuns. And then when I say Dutiyampi, it's like saying for the second time, and then when I say Tatiyampi for the third time, etc. Anyway, so that's the Triple Gem of Buddhism. The 10 precepts of Buddhism, these are do's and don'ts for all Buddhists. Lay people, in other words, people that are not monks and nuns, are expected to follow the first 5, and then there are special 5 that are tacked onto that for monks and nuns for a total of 10. The first 5 sort of have a kind of 10 Commandment kind of feel to them, and these are for everyone, and they are, number 1, ahimsa and nonviolence. You should refrain from hurting animals, from hurting people. So ahimsa, number 1. Number 2, don't take what doesn't belong to you and what's not given to you. Number 3, don't abuse sex. If you are married, be faithful to your spouse. If you're not married, be chaste. Number 4, don't lie or otherwise deceive other people. And number 5, don't, and I'm using today's language, don't drink or do drugs. In other words, keep a clear mind. And then there's an additional 5 for monks and nuns, and they are as follows. Don't eat after noon. So after their noon meal, they're expected to fast until the next morning. Number 7, don't dance and sing or attend parties or things of that nature. Number 8, don't adorn yourself. Don't use perfumes. Don't tattoo your body. Don't use jewelry or makeup, etc. Number 9, don't sleep in comfortable beds. And the way I take that is that you should live just in a very Spartan, functional way. You should not overly indulge in your material surroundings, basically. And then finally, don't handle money. So that's the 10 precepts. And then finally, a couple of important principles that I haven't hit on yet. One is anicca, A-N-I-C-C-A, which is the doctrine of impermanence. And the idea here is that everything is impermanent, which is the reason why we should give up everything. I mean, if there's nothing permanent, then there's nothing to cling to. So all things are fleeting, temporary, transient, and impermanent. Here's one way you can sort of conceptualize that idea. Imagine watching a film. And of course, as you're watching the screen, there's continuous movement, continuous action. But if you were to go up in the projection booth, now we're talking about old analog film, and take the film strip out of the projector and hold it up like this, as you look at it, what you actually see are separate photos, separate frames. I'm sure most of you have seen film strips. Well, actually, when you hold this up and look at it, that's the reality. That's the reality. What you see on the screen is an illusion. Of course, they produce this illusion by running the film strip fast enough to where it produces the illusion of continuous movement. And so the Buddhists would tell us that we live in a world of illusion, and the goal is to see reality as it actually is. And one characteristic of reality as it actually is impermanence. All things are impermanent. And that is one of the primary causes of dukkha, suffering. And because in fact we sort of delude ourselves into thinking that some things are permanent and we expect them to last. And when they don't, it brings on sadness. When things change, it brings on sadness. Another related term and an important principle is anatta, A-N-A-T-T-A. And that's in Pali. In Sanskrit, the word is anatman. And you'll hear the word atman, which means something like soul in Hinduism. So anatman, no soul. So often people describe this as the doctrine of no soul. And this basically means that, according to Buddhists, there is no permanent self or soul. And obviously this is a byproduct of the general doctrine of impermanence, anicca. So if Buddhists embrace reincarnation, which they do, what actually then goes on? Well, there's nothing permanent that passes on from one physical form to the next, but there are essences of individuals called khandhas, K-H-A-N-D-H-A-S, khandhas. What are these? Well, there's form, there's sensation, there's perception, there's mental formations, and there's consciousness. So things like memories and impressions and certain personality attributes do pass on. But these are also changing. So there's nothing permanent that moves on from one life to the next.